This is part five and the last video in my series on how I stopped being an alcoholic. If you haven't seen those previous videos, you may want to have a look at them first. So I'll leave a link to those older videos in the description below. So in my previous videos, I described how once I realized what it was that attracted me so much to alcohol, and I found a better way of getting those things, it was that allowed me to finally break free. Now, this wasn't a case of simply moving from one addiction to another, a mistake I'd made many times before. It wasn't that I used meditation and practices as a replacement for alcohol, as a new form of seeking. What actually happened was I used these practices to lead me to a situation where I no longer was desperately seeking like I used to be for something to fix me. So here in Thailand, you'll hear people talking about hungry ghosts, and these are these entities that are believed to have these very small mouths and very big tummies. And what this means is that these creatures, these entities, can never ever satisfy their hunger. And this is often used to depict the mind state of addiction, this idea of a hungry ghost. And what I found myself was that this sense of being a hungry ghost would continue whether I was drinking or whether I wasn't drinking, and was often the case of just moving into new addictions. An addiction for me, became this recovery thing, this never-ending self-improvement project. And what that involved was always trying to fix myself and never reaching a point where I felt fixed. This kind of constant seeking to be something other than what I was at that moment. And I kind of realized that just wasn't enough for me. So even though I wouldn't be drinking, it was kind of like, moving to a new prison where I had a much nicer prison warden and, a much nicer cell. But really, the fact that seeking was there still made me uncomfortable. So what would eventually happen is I would lose the motivation to stay sober and I just relapse again. So what I was after was this thing I call well-being, and well-being, part of how I would describe it, is an absence of seeking. Now, when I talk about an absence of seeking, I don't mean that we just become completely unmotivated and we don't do anything. I'm talking about that seeking to be always fixing ourselves and always kind of that causes us to keep on rejecting what's here. Well-being, it's a change in how we relate to reality. And even though, the practices I've described in the previous videos were a very important part of my own journey to achieving well-being, this kind of change in perception, it's not dependent on practices. It's something that's beyond kind of practices. It's this whole new way of relating to reality. Of course, the practices themselves, like even meditation, could eventually become just a new form of seeking. And that's okay up until a point. And that was, how it was for me for a long time. So I spent kind of thousands of hours in meditation, desperately seeking this thing called, awakening, which is kind of vague, and there's a lot of disagreement about what it actually involves. And until one day I noticed that the thing I was actually after, the thing I originally set out to find, this kind of well-being, was already there, and all I needed to do was to let go of that seeking, which is easy to do once I recognized the well-being and I'd kind of reached the point where I wanted to reach. So I found well-being has these three aspects to it: curiosity, intimacy, and trust. And I'll go into what I mean by each of these now. So curiosity means starting to interact with our environment with this sense of not knowing, with this sense of wonder. So rather than this kind of telling the world what it is and always kind of creating a story about what we're perceiving, we start to see that everything is incredibly unique, and that the more we open our attention to it, the more wonderful it becomes. As I said in the last video, when we talked about the imaginal practices, we start to see that, when we wait for, life to present itself, with that sense of patience, and we patiently wait, suddenly everything becomes much more interesting and much more magical and much more enchanting. And this is similar to how we experience life as young children. Often when I introduce this sense of curiosity to clients, they will often say that, it seems life starts to seem very, very trippy and very, very dreamlike. And that's because that's how it actually is. It's our kind of stale mind, our kind of the fact that we're usually lost in thinking that means we don't get to see that magical quality about life. So intimacy is this opening up to life. The Zen teacher Dogen used to talk about intimacy with the 10,000 things, and that's how he described awakening. And what this intimacy is this kind of this lowering of this sense of separation between us and everything else, because we start to see that we are just as much life as everything else. And that sense of separation has been created by our own kind of need to protect ourselves. So as we kind of do practices like, say, the friendliness practice, that need to protect ourselves starts to disappear. And as we open more and more, we start to experience this intimacy that's already kind of there waiting for us. Trust is all about ending our argument with reality. And it arises, because we start to recognize how our suffering is being caused by this rejection of what's already here. So either we want stuff that is here not to be here, or we want stuff that isn't here to be here. And that is our suffering. And we can start to see this in insight practices, in the Vipassana practice. So for example, say we suddenly start feeling anxious. We didn't choose for that to happen. There's no sense of choosing, oh, I fancy a bit of anxiousness now. What happens is that just something that kind of arises. But the mind can then respond, well, I shouldn't be feeling this way. So that shouldn't be feeling this way comes from that sense that we chose it and that somehow we can unchoose it. And that's not actually what happens. But it's this rejection of stuff that's already here and cannot be changed that is the source of our suffering. And trust means not doing that. It's this acceptance of what's here. And of course, we're not talking about people we can easily misunderstand this to mean, well, this kind of fatalism where, oh yeah, it doesn't matter what happens. We're only being asked to accept what's already here, to trust what's already here, and to not reject it. And when we are able to do that, our suffering stops. And the teacher Anthony de Mello beautifully called this, absolute cooperation with the inevitable. So well-being is this permanent shift in how we experience reality. And unlike other things which we seek and which we may have spent years seeking, we usually seek things that are impermanent, things that are always changing. So say we seek happiness, like the feeling of happiness. Happiness by its nature is an object that's kind of comes and goes, it changes, it's not always there, so it's not dependent. But well-being isn't an object. It's not the same as a thought or a mood or a feeling. Well-being it's a relationship with reality, a relationship reality that can be there no matter what's going on. So even when there's sadness, there can be still this sense of curiosity, intimacy, and trust. It can be there with any state. So it's like our well-being, that relationship with reality is something permanent. And we find, well, at least I found, that that's what I was looking for all along. So that's the end of this series. I hope you found it useful. If you did, please share it with other people and come over and visit my website at paulgarrigan.com. Thanks very much for watching.